moment that changed everything didn't happen in a boardroom. It didn't happen at a charity gala or on the front page of a business magazine. It happened on a Tuesday evening under a highway overpass on the east side of the city when Elliot Crane looked down from his car window and saw the woman who cleaned his kitchen every morning, asleep on the cold concrete, her elderly mother curled beside her, wrapped in a thin donated blanket that was doing almost nothing against the wind. He sat in his car for 11 minutes. He didn't call anyone. He didn't take a photo. He just sat there watching, and for the first time in 22 years of building a billion-dollar empire, Elliot Crane felt something crack open inside his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before the bridge, there was the kitchen. And before the kitchen, there was the morning Elliot noticed something he should have noticed months ago. Delia Monroe had worked in his household for 3 years. She arrived every weekday at 7 in the morning, let herself in with her key, and had coffee ready before Elliot came downstairs. She was precise. She was quiet. She moved through his house like someone who understood that her job was to make his life seamless, and she was exceptional at it. He had given her a raise twice. He had recommended her to 2 colleagues. He trusted her completely. But somewhere between January and March of that year, something changed. It started with her hands. Elliot wasn't the kind of man who noticed small things, or at least, he told himself he wasn't. But one morning he reached past her to grab the coffee pot, and he caught a glimpse of her knuckles. They were cracked, bleeding slightly at the edges. The kind of damage you get from sleeping in the cold, from washing your hands with whatever soap is available in a public restroom, from living in conditions that a person's skin was never meant to endure. He didn't say anything. A week later, he noticed her jacket. It was the same jacket she'd worn in October. It was now February. He lived in a city where February meant bone-deep cold, where the wind off the highway could drop the temperature 10 degrees before you even got to your front door. And Delia Monroe was showing up to work every morning in the same thin jacket she'd been wearing since fall. He still didn't say anything, because people like Elliot Crane, people who had built everything themselves, who had learned early that survival meant not showing weakness, not asking questions, not letting sentiment cloud judgment. People like that had a very specific way of not seeing things they didn't know how to fix. But the body keeps its own truth. And on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of March, Delia Monroe's body finally told it. She was at the kitchen counter, transferring dishes from the drying rack to the cabinet. Elliot was at the island, answering emails. He heard the sound before he registered what it was. A sharp intake of breath, a soft collision with the counter, and then the unmistakable sound of someone's knees hitting the floor. He was around the island before the second dish finished shattering. Delia was on the kitchen tiles, conscious but barely, her eyes open and unfocused, her breathing shallow and rapid. Elliot called emergency services before he even fully understood what he was seeing. He knelt beside her. He told her to stay still. He noticed, for the first time up close, how much weight she had lost, how her uniform hung off her shoulders now, how her face had sharpened in a way that had nothing to do with health. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. They were professional, calm, efficient. They checked her vitals, asked her questions she answered in a voice barely above a whisper, and stabilized her before moving her to the gurney. One of the paramedics, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and the manner of someone who had seen every kind of human crisis, pulled Elliot aside in the hallway. She didn't ask how old Delia was. She didn't ask about her medical history or her insurance. She asked, "Do you know if she has somewhere to sleep at night?" Elliot looked at her. "She's my housekeeper." The paramedic didn't flinch. "I know, but her core temperature, her weight, the condition of her skin, these aren't things you see in someone with a warm home and regular meals. I'm not diagnosing anything. I'm just asking." Elliot had no answer. She nodded once, like she'd expected that, and went back to her patient. Elliot stood in his hallway for a long time after the ambulance left. He stood there in his house that had 11 rooms and 4 bathrooms and a wine cellar he never used, and he stood there with one question echoing through every corridor of his mind. Did he know? Had he known and simply chosen not to ask? He called her supervisor at the agency. He was told Delia had a good record, always on time, No complaints. No address on file beyond a P.O. box. He called the hospital. She'd been treated and discharged within the afternoon against medical advice, citing a prior commitment. On a Thursday evening, after being hospitalized for collapse due to severe malnutrition and exposure, Delia Monroe checked herself out of the hospital because she had somewhere she needed to be. That was when Elliot Crane made the decision that would unravel everything. He decided to follow her, not to expose her, not to confirm his fears. He told himself he just needed to know she was safe. He told himself it was concern. Maybe it was. But somewhere underneath the concern was something else. A guilt he hadn't yet named, pressing upward to the floor of his conscience like water rising through old wood. The next morning, Delia arrived at 7 as usual. She said nothing about the hospital. She moved through his kitchen with the same precision, the same quiet competence, slightly slower perhaps, slightly more careful with her movements, but present, professional, composed. Elliot watched her all day. He said nothing. At 5 o'clock, she put on that thin jacket, picked up her bag, and walked out his front door. Elliot gave her 2 minutes, then followed. He kept 3 cars behind her on the bus. He had never taken that bus route before. It moved east, away from the part of the city he knew, away from the restaurants and the office towers and the glass front gyms, and into a stretch of the city that existed on a different frequency entirely. Corner stores with metal grates, laundromats still open at 6 in the evening, bus shelters with no glass left in the panels. Delia rode, without looking out the window. She sat with her bag in her lap, her hands folded on top of it, her eyes forward. She looked like someone conserving energy. She looked like someone who had learned to make themselves small enough that the world stopped trying to take things from them. She got off at the last stop before the highway interchange. Elliot followed on foot, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice. The light was going gray and flat, the kind of early evening that erases shadows and makes everything look like a photograph taken before color was invented. He watched her walk past the last row of storefronts, turn left down a service road, and disappear beneath the overpass. He stopped walking. He told himself it was because he didn't want to be seen. But the truth was simpler than that. The truth was that he already knew what he was going to find, and his body understood something his mind was still refusing. That whatever he was about to see was going to require something from him that he hadn't prepared for. He walked to the edge of the overpass and looked down. There were 2 of them, Delia and an older woman, 70, maybe older, her white hair cropped close, her body folded into a sleeping bag on top of a flattened cardboard arrangement that had been constructed with a kind of careful attention that broke your heart to look at. Plastic sheeting overhead, anchored to the bridge support with zip ties, a folding table, a small battery lantern, a crate with organized containers, food, medicine, supplies, stacked with the quiet discipline of someone who had decided that dignity was something you built yourself when nobody gave it to you. Delia was kneeling beside the older woman, helping her sit up. She was speaking quietly. She pressed the back of her hand to the woman's forehead, then reached into her bag and removed a small paper container. Take-out food, still warm, steam rising from the opening. She had bought it on the way. She had spent money she could not afford on a warm meal for someone she loved, and she was spooning it carefully into a bowl she produced from the organized crate. And she was doing all of this with the same quiet competence she brought to every task in Elliot's kitchen. Elliot Crane, who had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without his voice shaking, who had stood in front of auditoriums of investors and never lost his footing, stood on the edge of that overpass and could not move. The older woman said something, and Delia laughed. A real laugh, low, exhausted, but real, the kind of laugh that lives at the bottom of a person, underneath everything that's been piled on top of it. Elliot drove home. He sat in his car in his own driveway for 45 minutes. Then he went inside and started making phone calls. He called his head of security, a man named Carver who had worked for him for a decade and understood that certain assignments required discretion over explanation. He gave Carver one task: find out everything about Delia Monroe's last 12 months, not her job record, not her references, her life, what happened to her home, what happened to her money, what happened to bring her from wherever she'd been to that concrete floor under a highway. Carver called back in 36 hours. What he found was not a story of bad luck. It was a story of deliberate destruction. Delia had, 14 months ago, been living in a rented apartment on the west side. Small, but decent. She had a savings account with $11,000 in it. Not wealthy, not comfortable, but stable. The kind of stability that takes years to build on a housekeeper's wage. She had a brother. His name was Raymond Monroe. Younger than Delia by 4 years, a man with a long history of financial shortcuts and borrowed money that never found its way back to the people who'd lent it. Delia had supported him for years, quietly, without complaint, the way she did everything. Raymond had moved in with their mother when her health declined. He had told Delia he was caring for her. He told her he needed money for the medical bills. And Delia, who trusted him because he was her blood, who trusted him because she had no reason not to, had given it to him, transfer after transfer, across 8 months, until the savings account was empty. Then Raymond had gone to the landlord. He had presented himself as Delia's representative. He had, using a combination of forged documents and a story about Delia relocating for work, terminated her lease. He had collected the security deposit. He had taken the last of the furniture Delia had accumulated over 12 years. And then Raymond Monroe had gone to wherever people like Raymond go when they had burned the last bridge behind them. He had left their sick mother behind, in the apartment they no longer had the lease for, with no money, no plan, and an eviction notice that arrived 6 days after the lease cancellation went through. Delia had come home from work to find her mother sitting on the front steps of a building that was no longer her home, with 3 bags beside her containing everything the building manager had decided was worth keeping. She had not called the police. She had not called a lawyer. She had not told anyone at work. She had not told Elliot. She had found the bridge. She had made it as safe as she could. She had kept her job. She had kept her mother alive. She had kept herself together in a way that required a kind of inner strength that most people will never have to find out if they possess. And every morning, she had shown up at 7 o'clock, made the coffee, and done her job without asking for a single thing she hadn't earned. Elliot read Carver's report sitting at his kitchen island. The same island where Delia stood every morning, the same kitchen where she had collapsed 3 days ago. He read it twice, then he set it down and did not move for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was to Carver, who was standing quietly across the room. "How long?" Elliot asked. Carver understood the question. 14 months. Give or take. 14 months. For 14 months, the woman who made his coffee had been sleeping on concrete. For 14 months, she had been caring for a sick elderly woman with no heat, no running water, no medical support beyond whatever she could manage with the contents of an organized crate. For 14 months, she had looked him in the eye every single day and said, "Good morning, Mr. Crane." And he had said morning and gone back to his phone. "There's something else," Carver said. Elliot looked up. Raymond Monroe. He didn't do this alone. Someone was feeding him information. Her schedule, her paycheck dates, the timing of her deposits. He knew exactly when her account would be at its highest before he started pulling from it. He knew her work hours well enough to time the lease termination for when she'd be here, unable to respond until it was too late. Elliot was very still. Someone inside this house? Carver placed a single sheet of paper on the counter. A name. One Elliot recognized. The crack that had opened in his chest the night at the overpass. It split wide open now. The name on that paper was Thomas Hurd. Thomas had been Elliot's household manager for 5 years. He handled scheduling, vendor relationships, and staff coordination. He was the person who had recommended Delia's agency in the first place. He was the person who processed her timesheets and submitted her payment every 2 weeks. He had access to everything. Elliot had never questioned Thomas. Thomas was efficient. Thomas was agreeable. Thomas had a talent for making himself indispensable in the quiet background way that certain people master. Never flashy enough to create envy, never upset enough to create suspicion. Just there, reliable, invisible in the way that useful things become invisible. Carver had done thorough work. He had traced a series of payments from an account connected to Raymond Monroe to a second account, a personal account, unrelated to household finances, registered in the name of a shell company. That led, after 3 layers of financial redirection, back to Thomas Hurd. Raymond had paid him, not a large amount, in the scheme of things, $1,700 across 4 separate transfers. $1,700 to destroy a woman's life. $1,700 to give Raymond Monroe the precise information he needed to drain his own sister's savings and vanish. Elliot sat with this information for 2 days. He did not confront Thomas. He did not call his lawyer yet. He kept his face neutral and his manner consistent. Because Elliot Crane had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can do when you discover betrayal is to let the betrayer know they've been discovered before you're ready. He had one conversation first, the one he'd been circling. He asked Carver to arrange for a doctor to visit the overpass, framed as an outreach initiative, nothing tied to Elliot's name, to assess the elderly woman's medical condition. The report came back within 24 hours. Severe respiratory infection, early signs of kidney stress, manageable with treatment, but deteriorating without it. Then he drove to the overpass himself. In the late morning, when Delia would be at his house, just to stand there and understand fully what he was carrying. The space was tidier than he'd expected. That almost made it harder. The cardboard had been reinforced. The plastic sheeting had been extended. Someone, Delia, had found a small electric heater, the kind that runs on a portable battery pack, and positioned it beside where her mother slept. There were books in a crate, a folded photograph laminated against the moisture, flowers, artificial, bright yellow, in a cracked glass jar. She had made it a home, in the only material she had, under a bridge in a city of towers and glass. Delia Monroe had made a home for her mother because that was what she did. That was who she was. Elliot left before anyone could see him. That evening, he called his attorney. He called his property manager. He called a home health care agency. He called a furniture company. He made a list, and he worked through it methodically, the way he worked through any complex logistics problem, except at this time, his hands were not entirely steady. He dealt with Thomas Hurd on a Friday afternoon, after Delia had gone home for the day. He called Thomas into the study. He placed Carver's report on the desk between them, said nothing, and watched the man's face. Thomas lasted about 40 seconds before the composure broke. What came out wasn't an apology so much as a cascade of self-justification. He needed the money. Raymond had said Delia would be fine. He hadn't understood the full extent of what would happen. He'd thought she had other arrangements. Elliot let him finish. Then he spoke for about 3 minutes, quietly, without raising his voice, and said everything that needed to be said. At the end, he instructed Thomas to remain available for the legal process that was coming, to make no contact with Raymond Monroe, and to leave the property that evening. He had his attorney move immediately on both fronts. Thomas's termination and the legal case against Raymond Monroe, with Carver's documentation and the financial trail already mapped. The process moved faster than Thomas had likely expected. Raymond, it turned out, had made the specific kind of mistakes that leave trails. He'd used his own name on enough of the transactions to make the fraud case straightforward. Justice of the legal variety, at least, was in motion. But Elliot kept returning to the part that no court could address. 14 months. And Delia had never asked him for help. He had thought about that at length, in the evenings, trying to understand it. And he had arrived, slowly, at something that felt close to truth. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't pride in the toxic sense. It was something more complicated. A woman who had spent her entire life watching the people around her extract and consume and disappear, who had built her survival on never being a burden, never being a vulnerability, never giving anyone a reason to decide she was more trouble than she was worth. She had hidden it from him not because she didn't trust him. She had hidden it from him because trust, for Delia Monroe, had become a luxury she could no longer afford. That realization settled into Elliot differently than the anger about Thomas, differently than the legal momentum against Raymond. It settled in and stayed. It asked him a question about himself that he was still in the process of answering. What kind of man had he been in that kitchen all those months? Not cruel, not malicious, just absent, just incurious, just comfortable enough in his own life that someone else's erasure had gone unnoticed at the range of arm's length. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building 12 minutes from his house. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't a gesture designed to overwhelm or to make Delia feel like a charity case. He had thought hard about that. It was comfortable, warm. It had 2 bedrooms, one for Delia and one for her mother. It had a kitchen with good light. It had a bathroom with a door that locked and a shower with consistent hot water, and a window that looked out at a row of trees that were just beginning to show the first thin edge of spring. He had the home health care arranged, a nurse who would come 3 times a week to manage her mother's treatment plan, with a physician on call for escalations. He had the furniture set to arrive on a Thursday. He had ensured the refrigerator was stocked. He had left nothing to chance. He had also left no note. What he left was a key and a single envelope on the kitchen counter inside the apartment, which he had accessed with the property manager's help, containing a single index card with 3 handwritten lines. Delia Monroe found out on a Thursday afternoon. She didn't find out the way Elliot had planned. The plan had been for Carver to leave the key and the apartment address in a sealed envelope with her agency, with no attached explanation. Anonymous, just a key and a location, with the first 3 months paid. What actually happened was that Delia's mother told her the doctor Elliot had quietly arranged a visit the overpass had, in the course of earning her trust, told the older woman that help was coming from someone who had been paying attention. She had not named Elliot, but Delia's mother was 71 years old and had raised 2 children in circumstances that had required her to read situations precisely, and she had understood immediately. She had also, it turned out, known about Thomas for months before Delia did. She had noticed things, small things, inconsistencies in what Raymond told her about how he knew Delia's schedule, patterns in the timing of the transfers. She had been afraid to tell Delia, afraid it would break her. She had carried it alone, tucked beneath everything else she was carrying. It was Delia's mother who finally spoke all of it aloud. On a Thursday evening, sitting on the edge of a folding cot under a bridge that they would not be sleeping on for very much longer. She had taken Delia's hands in hers, those cracked, work-worn hands, and she had said, "You have been protecting everyone your whole life, every single person who was supposed to protect you. You protected your brother when he didn't deserve it. You protected your job. You protected me. You protected your pride because it was the last thing you had left that was yours. And I am your mother, and I am telling you right now, let somebody in. Let one person in." Delia did not answer for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I don't know how to do that." Her mother squeezed her hands. "I know. That's what I'm most sorry about." The next morning, Delia arrived at Elliot's house at 7 o'clock. She let herself in with her key. She started the coffee. Elliot was already in the kitchen. This was unusual. He was typically not downstairs until 7:20. She glanced at him, registered the unusualness of it, and said nothing. She moved the coffee pot. Her hands were still cracked. The thin jacket hung on the hook by the door. Elliot set something on the counter, between them. She looked at it. A key. No label. No envelope. Just a key on a ring with a small card attached. The address of the apartment. Delia looked at the key for a long time. She didn't pick it up. Her jaw tightened. He could see the precise internal negotiation happening behind her eyes. The part of her that wanted to push it back across the counter, to say thank you but no, to preserve the specific dignified distance that had kept her intact through everything. He spoke before she could. "I know what Thomas did. I know what your brother did. I know about the lease and the account. I know about your mother. I know about the last 14 months. He paused. "I'm sorry it took me this long to pay attention." Delia's hands were flat on the counter. She looked at the key. Something moved through her face. The kind of movement that happens in people who've been holding something for so long that the act of setting it down feels like a physical event. She didn't cry. Not in that moment. She picked up the key. She held it in her hand for several seconds. The way you hold something you don't entirely trust yet. The way you hold something fragile that you've been afraid to want. Then she looked at Elliot and said, "How is the rent structured?" He almost smiled. "It's not." She shook her head slightly. "I don't do charity. I know you don't. So let's call it what it is. What should have been in place the moment your situation was on my radar? Consider a correction." She looked at him for a long moment. The coffee finished brewing. The kitchen was quiet and warm. "I want to pay something," she said. We can discuss a figure that makes you comfortable. I want to pay something real. Then we'll find a real figure. She nodded once. She put the key in her jacket pocket. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She set one on his side of the island, without being asked. Then she went back to her work. Elliot picked up his coffee. He didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say that the key hadn't already said, that the poured coffee hadn't already answered. The legal case against Raymond Monroe concluded 4 months later. He was convicted on 3 counts of financial fraud and 1 of document forgery. Thomas Hurd settled in a civil suit. The settlement was modest. The principal was not. Delia's mother responded well to treatment. By summer, she was gardening in the small courtyard outside the building. Sunflowers, mostly. In containers, she'd painted herself in colors that were impossible to look at without feeling something shift loose in your chest. Delia stayed in the apartment. She stayed in the job. She never discussed the bridge with anyone. As far as Elliot knew, she didn't talk about Raymond, didn't talk about Thomas, didn't talk about what 14 months on concrete had done to her body or what it had required of her. What she did, 3 months after moving into the apartment, was begin leaving a second coffee on the counter every morning without comment, even on the days Elliot came down late, even on the days the kitchen was empty and no one was there to drink it. He never asked her why. He already understood. Some debts don't have a number attached to them. Some corrections can't be made in full. What you can do, what you can choose when you finally start paying attention, is show up every day, quietly, and make sure the coffee is warm. Elliot Crane had spent 22 years building things that were measured in dollars and market share, and the kind of legacy that gets printed in financial journals. This was the first thing he had ever built that he was not sure he deserved, and that, more than anything that had come before it, was the beginning of him becoming someone who did. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of what Delia carried and what it finally cost her to let it down, subscribe to Echo Tales by Ken. We drop emotional, powerful stories that stay with you. Hit that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one.